A 5-year-old doesn't remember what you said at dinner. She remembers that you let her stir the soup. That's not a metaphor. That's how memory works in a developing brain. The hippocampus, the part that handles long-term memory, is still under construction at that age. It doesn't store lectures. It doesn't file away corrections. What it locks in, what it encodes so deep it becomes part of who a person is, are sensory moments wrapped in emotion. The smell of garlic in a warm kitchen, the feeling of a wooden spoon that's too big for her hand, the sound of someone humming next to her who wasn't in a hurry. That was you. And the thing nobody tells you, not the parenting books, not the pediatricians, and certainly not your own kids when they're handing you a list of foods the baby can't have, is that what grandparents do matters in ways that are almost impossible to replicate any other way. Not because you're sweet, not because you spoil them, because of something structural about who you are in a child's life and what that position makes possible. Let me explain what I mean by structural, because it's the whole thing. Parents are under pressure, constant, grinding, low-grade pressure that never fully lifts. They have to get the kid fed, dressed, to school, through homework, off screens, into bed. They have to enforce. They have to say no 40 times before lunch. They have to be the wall the kid pushes against, because that's how kids learn where the edges are. It's exhausting and necessary, and it shapes the relationship whether anyone wants it to or not. You're not the wall. You're the window. And a kid needs both, but the window does something the wall can't. The window is where a child gets to feel like the world is big and interesting, and not just a series of rules to follow. Where someone older and calmer says, not in words, but in how they move, how they listen, how they let time pass, that this child is worth slowing down for, that they're not a task to be managed. You probably already know this in your gut, but let me give you the scaffolding underneath it so you trust what you know. There's a concept in developmental psychology called the stress buffer. It comes from work done at Harvard's Center on the Developing Child, and it's simple enough. When a child is in a stressful environment, and that doesn't mean abuse, it can just mean a busy household with 2 working parents and a lot of rushing, the presence of a stable, calm, emotionally available adult can physically change what happens in that child's brain. Cortisol levels drop. The prefrontal cortex, which handles impulse control and planning and empathy, gets more room to develop. The child's nervous system literally learns that the world contains people who are safe. Grandparents are disproportionately likely to be that person. Not because you're better than the parents, because you're not in the middle of the storm. You already raised your kids. You're not trying to prove anything. You've got less to lose and more to give. And children can feel that the way they can feel whether someone's really listening or just waiting for their turn to talk. Here's where it gets interesting. A 2017 study out of Boston College, led by a researcher named Sarah Moorman, looked at the emotional closeness between grandparents and adult grandchildren. Not little kids, adults in their 20s and 30s. What she found was that the grandparent-grandchild bond was one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being for both sides. Both sides. Grandchildren who reported a close relationship with a grandparent had significantly lower rates of depression. And so did the grandparents. This wasn't about gifts or trips to Disneyland. It was about what Moorman called emotional give and take, meaning the grandparent listened, the grandchild felt heard, and over time, that built something that held up long after the kid outgrew the lap. But here's what I want you to sit with. That bond didn't just appear when the grandchild turned 22 and suddenly appreciated you. It was built when they were 4 and 6 and 9. It was built in the ordinary moments that nobody photographed. So let's talk about what those moments actually are. Because they're not what the internet tells you. If you search how to be a good grandparent, you'll get listicles that read like they were written by someone who's never changed a diaper. Be supportive. Be present. Respect boundaries. Don't undermine the parents. Fine. All true. and about as useful as telling someone who wants to learn piano to practice regularly. The habits that actually shape a child aren't items on a list. They're almost invisible. They happen in the texture of time spent together, and most of them have one thing in common: they cannot be rushed. Here's the first one, and it might be the most important one. You let silence happen. I don't mean you sit there staring at each other. I mean, when you're with a grandchild, you're not constantly filling the air. You're not narrating. You're not quizzing. You're not turning every moment into a teaching opportunity. You're just there, doing something together, or doing nothing together, and letting the kid's brain have room. This is rarer than you think. Most adults in a child's life are talking at them. Teachers are instructing. Parents are managing. Coaches are directing. The phone is pinging. The TV is going. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a child's brain is trying to do something it desperately needs to do: process, integrate, daydream, make sense of things at its own pace. When you sit on the porch and let your granddaughter just mess around with a stick and a puddle for 20 minutes without suggesting she do something else, you're giving her brain a gift that almost no one else in her life is giving her. You're giving her unstructured time with a safe person. Developmental psychologists call this serve and return when it's interactive. The child does something, you respond, she responds to your response. But there's a quieter version of it that doesn't have a fancy name. It's just being with someone who isn't trying to optimize you. Kids can feel the difference between someone who's with them and someone who's watching the clock. And your grandkids can feel it in you. That's not a small thing. For some of them, you might be the only person in their life who isn't watching the clock. Here's the second one. You tell them things about the family. Not the polished version, not the Christmas letter version, the real one. You tell your grandson that his mother was afraid of thunderstorms until she was 12. You tell your granddaughter that her dad failed his driver's test the first time and cried in the parking lot. You tell them about the uncle who moved to Alaska and nobody heard from for 3 years and then showed up at Thanksgiving like nothing happened. This sounds like just storytelling. It's not. There's a psychologist at Emory University named Marshall Duke who, along with his colleague Robin Fivish, spent years studying what makes families resilient. What they found was that the single best predictor of a child's emotional health and resilience was whether the child knew their family's story, not a sanitized story, the real one. The setbacks, the recoveries, the weird detours, the people who messed up and tried again. They called it the do you know scale. Do you know where your grandparents met? Do you know about an illness or hardship someone in your family faced? Do you know the story of your birth? Children who could answer these questions had higher self-esteem, a stronger sense of control over their own lives, and lower rates of anxiety. And who's the keeper of those stories? It's not the parents. Parents are too close to their own history. They edit. They skip. They're still living out the consequences of some of those stories and don't always have the distance to tell them straight. You do. When you sit at that kitchen table, and maybe this is literally your kitchen table, the one your grandchild sits at with their feet not quite reaching the floor, and you tell them about the time the family business almost went under, or the summer your own mother took in a neighbor's kid because things were bad next door, or the year you almost didn't make it to college, you're doing something no app, no curriculum, no amount of enrichment can do. You're giving that child a place in a story that started before they were born. You're teaching them that struggle is normal, that people recover, that their family is made of real people who kept going. That's not nostalgia. That's architecture. You're building the frame they'll hang their own life on. Third habit, and this one's subtle. You let them be good at something you're not. Your 8-year-old grandchild knows more about Minecraft than you will ever know, or dinosaurs, or whatever the current obsession is. And when you let them explain it to you, really explain it, not in a patronizing, oh, how nice way, but in a, wait, slow down, I actually want to understand this way, something shifts in that child. They become the expert, the teacher, the one who knows. For a kid who spends most of their life being told what to do by people who know more than they do, this is oxygen. It builds what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that you can do things, that your knowledge matters, that you have something to offer. And it builds it in a specific way that's hard to get anywhere else, because you're not performing interest. You genuinely don't know how redstone circuits work. Your confusion is real. Your questions are real. And so the child's sense of competence is real. I've watched grandparents do this instinctively, and it's one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in a family. A 70-year-old man sitting on the floor while a 6-year-old shows him how to build something on a screen, and the man is asking questions like he's talking to a colleague. Not baby talk, not, wow, you're so smart, just real curiosity. And the kid is standing a little straighter, talking a little more clearly, and doesn't even know why. Fourth, you hold the line on something the parents won't. Now, I'm not talking about undermining anyone. I'm not talking about sneaking the kids sugar or letting them stay up till midnight. I'm talking about the things that matter more than rules. Manners, looking someone in the eye, saying thank you and meaning it, writing a note by hand, sitting at a table without a screen, listening when someone else is talking. These things are falling away. You know it. I know it. The parents might know it too, but they're picking their battles and this one keeps losing. They're too tired to fight about thank you cards when they're already fighting about homework and bedtime and whether the kid can have a phone. You're not too tired, and you have something the parents don't. You have authority that comes from age, not from enforcement. When you say, "In this house we sit at the table," it doesn't land the same way it does when a parent says it. It lands like a standard, like the way things are done, like something that existed before the child was born and will exist after, and they're being invited into it, not punished by it. That distinction, invitation versus punishment, is everything. A child who learns to write a thank you note because grandma expects it, and because grandma treats it like a normal, dignified thing that people who respect each other do, is learning something different from a child who's forced to write one while complaining. The first child is learning a value. The second child is completing a task. Fifth, and this one's going to sound simple, but I want you to hear it as something bigger than it seems. You show up the same way every time. You're consistent, not in a rigid way, in a gravitational way. The grandchild knows that when they come to your house, certain things will be true. There will be that chair, that smell, that way you say their name when they come through the door, that thing you always have in the fridge that their parents don't buy. The routine isn't fancy. It isn't planned. It just is. And in a world that changes on a kid constantly, new teachers, new grades, new social hierarchies, new rules they didn't agree to, your consistency is a kind of emotional bedrock. It tells the child, at a level below language, that some things hold, that not everything shifts, that there's a place in the world that stays. Research on attachment theory, going all the way back to John Bowlby in the 1960s and extended by dozens of researchers since, makes this point over and over. Secure attachment isn't built by grand gestures. It's built by predictable warmth. The same response, the same welcome, the same tone, again and again and again, until the child's nervous system encodes it as truth. I am safe here. This person is not going anywhere. You might think that's the parent's job, and it is. But kids can have multiple attachment figures, and a grandparent who is reliably, quietly, undramatically present can serve as what's called a secondary attachment figure. And in some families, especially where parents are stretched thin or struggling, that secondary figure becomes the anchor. You don't have to do anything extraordinary to be that. You just have to keep showing up the same way and mean it. Now, I want to be honest about something, because if I'm not, you'll feel it and you won't trust anything else I've said. Some of this is hard. Not the showing up, not the storytelling. The other part. The part where your son or daughter tells you not to do something and you disagree, but you have to respect it anyway. The part where the visits are less frequent than you want. The part where you're on the other end of a FaceTime call and the kid is looking at something else and you're performing enthusiasm into a screen when what you want is to be in the room. The part where the other grandparents get more time. The part where the distance, miles or emotional or both, makes you wonder if any of this is landing. It's landing. It is landing in ways you will not see for 20 years. That Boston College study I mentioned, the grandchildren who reported the deepest bonds with their grandparents weren't the ones who saw them most often. They were the ones who felt known, who felt like their grandparents saw them clearly and accepted what they saw. Frequency helped, sure, but it wasn't the deciding factor. The deciding factor was whether the child felt like a full person in the grandparents' eyes, not a project, not a do-over, not a miniature version of someone else, but themselves. You can do that in a weekly phone call if the call is real. You can do that in a letter. And by the way, a handwritten letter from a grandparent is one of the few physical objects a person keeps their entire life. I've seen 60-year-olds pull them out of drawers. Yellowed paper, shaky handwriting, nothing profound, just, I was thinking about you, and I wanted you to know. Kept for 40 years, exposed to every move, every purge, every Marie Kondo phase, and it survived because it was irreplaceable. You are irreplaceable, not because of your role, because of your position in time. You're the living proof that the family has a past. You're the bridge between the world the child was born into and the world that came before. Without you, that bridge doesn't exist. History becomes abstract. The family becomes a flat thing that started with the parents. But with you, the child gets depth, gets roots, gets the sense, and this is a sense you can't manufacture, that they come from somewhere, that they're part of something that survived hard things and is still here. That sense of belonging, of continuity, is one of the most protective psychological forces a child can have. It's what catches them when the world gets confusing in middle school and cruel in high school and disorienting in their 20s. It's the voice in the back of their head that says, not in words but in feeling, I come from people who managed. I can manage too. You put that voice there, not with a speech, not with a lesson, with soup, with silence, with the sound of your humming on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing special was happening, and the child's brain, without anyone knowing it, was recording everything. So if you're wondering whether it matters, whether the visits matter, whether the calls matter, whether the stories about your mother's garden or your father's terrible sense of direction matter, let me just say this as plainly as I can. The research says yes. The data says yes. 3 generations of developmental psychology say yes. But you already knew that, because you remember your own grandparents' kitchen. You remember the chair. You remember how it smelled. You remember the way they said your name like it was the best word they knew. That's still in you, exposed to every move, every loss, every decade, and it survived. Now it's your turn to be the thing that survives in someone else. You don't need a strategy for that. You just need a kitchen table and a little time, and the sense, which I hope you have by now, that the quiet things were never the small things. They were the whole thing, all along.